In the quiet town of Zaria, nestled between the hills and the wide plains of Kaduna State, lived a girl named Ladi. From the moment she was born, life seemed to conspire against her. The town's children would run and play in the streets, their laughter filling the air like the songs of birds. But for Ladi, there was no joy in these sounds. While other children had parents who showered them with love, Ladi was raised by her stern and distant father. Her mother had died when Ladi was just a baby, leaving a hole in her life that no one ever filled. Ladi often sat by the edge of the town, watching the other children play. She longed to join them, to laugh and run like they did, but something always held her back. She wore old, tattered clothes handed down from neighbors who didn't need them anymore. Her shoes were worn out, and her hair, though thick and beautiful, was always unkempt. "Look at the poor girl," the children would whisper. "She's so strange. Why doesn't she ever play with us?" Every time Ladi heard their whispers, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She would turn away from them, pretending not to care, but deep inside, the loneliness gnawed at her. Each day after her chores, she would retreat to a small hill overlooking Zaria, where she could be alone with her thoughts. From there, she could see the town's busy market, the fields where men worked, and the soldiers patrolling. She dreamed of escaping her misery and becoming someone people respected, someone they feared. Ladi's father, Musa, was a tall, strong man with eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared to look into them. He was a soldier in his younger days, and even though he was no longer in the army, he ran his home as if it were a military camp. Discipline, strictness, and no room for softness, that was his way. And for Ladi, this meant endless chores, harsh punishments, and not a single word of affection. "Ladi, the firewood isn't enough. Go fetch more," he would bark at her, even when she had already spent hours collecting it. If she hesitated, the consequences were immediate: a stern look, or sometimes even a smack on the wrist. Ladi often cried herself to sleep at night. The darkness of her small room, with its single window overlooking the empty yard, felt like a reflection of her own heart. There were nights when she wished her mother were still alive, to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But those wishes were just dreams, and every morning, she awoke to the same harsh reality. One day, after her father scolded her harshly for dropping a pot of water, Ladi stood in the yard, staring at her hands. They were small, but she clenched them into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I will never be weak again," she whispered to herself. "No one will ever make me feel small." It was in that moment that something hardened inside her, a resolve that would change the course of her life. As Ladi grew older, her desire to become strong only intensified. She would often watch from the shadows as the soldiers marched through Zaria, their uniforms crisp, their boots pounding the earth in perfect rhythm. They held their heads high, and the people of Zaria showed them respect. The soldiers were fearless, powerful, and united. Ladi longed to be like them. One afternoon, while collecting water from the river, she saw a group of soldiers training on the far bank. They moved like one, their bodies glistening with sweat as they performed drills, shouted commands, and tested each other's strength. Ladi's heart raced as she watched them. These men were everything her father had taught her about strength. But more than that, they were free. No one told them they were weak. No one scolded them for small mistakes. They commanded respect simply by being who they were. As she stood there, clutching her water pot, Ladi made a decision. She would join the army. She would become one of those soldiers. No, she would become better than them. She would train harder, fight harder, and make sure no one could ever call her weak again. That night, after finishing her chores, she gathered her courage and went to her father. He was sitting by the fire, sharpening a blade, his face lit by the orange glow. "Baba," she said quietly, "I want to become a soldier." Her father didn't look up. "You?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "A soldier?" "Yes," Ladi replied, her voice steady. "I want to train. I want to be strong." For a long moment, her father was silent. Then he let out a cold laugh. "You? A girl? Soldiers are not for girls, Ladi. Go to bed and stop dreaming." Ladi felt a surge of anger. She had expected this reaction, but it still stung. Without saying another word, she turned and walked out of the room. But in her heart, she made a promise. No matter what her father thought, no matter what anyone thought, she would prove them wrong. Ladi's path to becoming a soldier was not easy. At first, the army didn't want to accept her. "A girl in the army?" the commander had scoffed. "Go home and help your father with the farm." But Ladi didn't give up. She showed up every day, watching the men train, practicing their moves in secret and even challenging some of the younger soldiers to spar. Her determination caught the attention of a few officers. "She's got heart," they would whisper. "Maybe we should give her a chance." Eventually, after months of persistence, they allowed her to join the training, but they didn't make it easy for her. The men would often mock her, laughing at her small size and telling her to go home before she got hurt. But Lady didn't care. She trained harder than anyone, waking up before dawn to run laps around the village, practicing her moves late into the night. Her body grew stronger, her mind sharper. She learned to fight, to strategize, and most of all, she learned to harden herself against the world. Her father still didn't approve of her decision, but he said nothing as she came home each day with bruises and cuts from her training. Maybe in some way, he was proud of her. As time went on, Ladi rose through the ranks of the army. Her fierce determination and no-nonsense attitude earned her the nickname Iron Lady. No one dared to cross her. If someone disrespected her, she would deal with them swiftly and without mercy. She had become the very thing she had always wanted, feared, respected, and powerful. But with power came something else. The fear in people's eyes when they looked at her began to feel satisfying. It was as if the more they feared her, the more powerful she became. She enjoyed watching men, especially, bow to her commands. Their pride shattered as they realized they couldn't stand up to her. For Ladi, this was justice for all the years she had felt small and powerless. As time passed, Ladi's reputation spread beyond Zaria. She became known in nearby villages as the Iron Lady, a soldier who took no nonsense and showed no mercy. The people of Zaria whispered her name in both awe and fear. Mothers would warn their children, "Don't misbehave, or the Iron Lady will come for you." But the more feared Ladi became, the more isolated she felt. Her position in the army was secure, and no one dared to challenge her authority, but she had no friends. She didn't laugh or smile. Even her fellow soldiers who once trained alongside her now kept their distance. They respected her, but they also feared her. And fear, Ladi realized, was a cold companion. Still, she convinced herself that this was the price of power. To be strong, to be respected, one had to be feared. "I am not that weak little girl anymore," she told herself. "This is what I wanted." But there were moments, late at night, when the town was quiet and she was alone, that doubt crept in. She would stare up at the stars and wonder if there was more to life than this constant struggle for power. Could there be something beyond fear? Something like love? Lady quickly pushed those thoughts away. Love was for the weak, and she was not weak. One hot afternoon, Ladi walked through the bustling market of Zaria. The sun was high in the sky, and the air buzzed with the sounds of traders shouting their prices, goats bleating, and children laughing as they ran between the stalls. Ladi wasn't interested in the noise or the people. She was there on business, and she moved with her usual sharpness, her eyes scanning the market like a hawk. People made way for her as soon as they saw her coming. They stepped back, some even bowing their heads as if her very presence commanded silence. She didn't say a word, but her reputation spoke for her. The Iron Lady never tolerated disrespect, and no one wanted to be the next person on the receiving end of her wrath. As Ladi moved toward the stalls selling grains and vegetables, she noticed a man standing in her path. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing simple farmer's clothes stained with the earth he worked. His back was turned to her, and he was busy haggling with a trader over the price of yams. Ladi narrowed her eyes and cleared her throat, expecting him to step aside, but the man didn't move. Ladi's patience, always thin, snapped. "Move out of my way," she barked, her voice cold and commanding. The people around her froze, watching to see what would happen next. The man turned slowly, clearly startled. His face was familiar. Ladi had seen him before in town. His name was Danjuma, a well-known farmer who sold his produce in the market. His eyes widened when he realized who was standing before him. I didn't see you there," Danjuma stammered, stepping back hastily. He was visibly nervous, but he hadn't acted quickly enough for Ladi's liking. In her eyes, he had shown her disrespect, and that was something she couldn't tolerate. "You didn't see me?" Ladi's voice rose, and the market fell silent. "You think you can block my path and pretend it's an accident? Who do you think you are?" Danjuma's face flushed with embarrassment, and he lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry," he said softly, but Ladi was far from satisfied. "You should be," she snapped. "Men like you think you can do whatever you want. You think you're so important because you work the land, but you are nothing. I am the one who keeps this town safe, not you." Remember your place, farmer." The onlookers were silent, their faces tense with discomfort. They had seen Ladi humiliate people before, but this was different. Danjuma was known to be kind and humble, and many in the town respected him, but no one dared speak up. Not against the Iron Lady. Without another word, Ladi turned and walked away, her boots striking the ground hard as she left the market. Behind her, Danjuma stood frozen in place, his face pale with shame. The rest of the day passed uneventfully for Ladi, but that night, as she lay in bed, her mind returned to the market. She saw Danjuma's face again, the way his shoulders had slumped when she had berated him in front of everyone. For the first time in a long while, Ladi felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Guilt. It was a strange, unwelcome feeling, like a thorn lodged deep in her chest. She pushed it away, telling herself that she had done the right thing. Danjuma had shown her disrespect, and she had put him in his place. That's what power was about, commanding respect, making sure no one ever crossed her. But even as she tried to convince herself, the nagging thought wouldn't leave her alone. What if she had gone too far? What if she had let her anger get the best of her? Lady tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. She got up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. The night was quiet, but in her mind, the scene in the market replayed over and over. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, Danjuma's face wouldn't fade from her memory. By morning, Ladi was more restless than ever. She needed to clear her mind, so she did what she always did when she felt uneasy. She trained. She went to the army barracks before dawn, running laps, practicing her strikes and kicks until her muscles ached. But no matter how hard she trained, the guilt still lingered. The days passed, but Ladi couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in her heart. She found herself thinking about Danjuma more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just his face or the way he had looked at her. It was the silence of the crowd, the way no one had said anything, but their eyes had spoken volumes. "What's wrong with me?" Ladi muttered to herself one evening as she sat alone in her small house. She had always prided herself on being strong, on not caring what others thought of her. But this was different. That night, she couldn't sleep again. The image of Danjuma standing in the market, his face red with embarrassment, haunted her. She tried to push the guilt away, reminding herself of who she was, the Iron Lady, the woman who commanded respect and fear. But deep down, Ladi couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than being feared. For the first time, she questioned her own actions. She had spent years building up her strength, making sure no one could ever hurt her again. But in doing so, had she become the very thing she despised? Ladi shook her head, trying to rid herself of the troubling thoughts. But it was no use. She had humiliated Danjuma, a man who had done nothing to deserve it, and now the weight of that decision sat heavily on her shoulders. As time passed, Ladi continued to carry out her duties as a soldier, but something had changed. She still commanded respect, and the people of Zaria still feared her, but she no longer found satisfaction in it. The fear in their eyes, which once gave her a sense of power, now made her feel empty. She still maintained her strict, no-nonsense attitude, but the weight of her decisions started to take a toll on her. Each time she punished someone or used her authority to get her way, she felt the guilt gnaw at her insides. But Ladi didn't know how to stop. She had built her life on being strong, on making people fear her. If she let that go, what would she have left? One evening, Ladi was sitting outside her home when a young soldier approached her. His name was Yakubu, and he had only recently joined the army. He stood nervously before her, shifting from foot to foot. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly, "I wanted to speak to you about something." Ladi looked up, her eyes sharp. "What is it, Yakubu?" Yakubu swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "I've heard some of the men talking, ma'am. They say you're too harsh. They say you don't need to be so cold." Ladi's eyes narrowed. "And what do you think, Yakubu? Do you think I'm too harsh?" Yakubu hesitated, then shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am. I just thought you should know." Ladi dismissed him with a wave of her hand, but his words stuck with her. Too harsh? Too cold? Was that really how people saw her? As she sat there in the fading light, Ladi realized that she had spent so long trying to prove herself to be strong that she had lost sight of what it meant to be human. She had built a wall around herself, a wall of fear and power, but now that wall was beginning to crack. A few weeks later, Ladi was summoned by the commander. There was trouble in a nearby village. Bandits had been raiding farms and attacking the villagers. The army had been called to protect the area, and Ladi was chosen to lead the mission. This was the kind of task Ladi excelled at. She gathered her team and set off for the village with a sense of purpose. The road to the village was long and winding, cutting through dense forests and open fields. As they marched, Ladi kept her soldiers on high alert, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. But even as she prepared for battle, her mind drifted back to the market and Danjuma. The guilt she had been carrying weighed heavily on her, and for the first time, she felt uncertain. Was she truly as strong as she believed, or was her strength merely a mask to hide her own fear? The village came into view as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. Ladi signaled for her soldiers to stop. They set up camp on the outskirts of the village, preparing for the night ahead. But as darkness fell, Ladi couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, the sound of horses galloping filled the air. Ladi's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The bandits had found them first. The sound of hooves thundered closer, sending chills down Ladi's spine. She had anticipated the bandits, but not this soon. Her soldiers scrambled to get into position, fumbling in the darkness to arm themselves. "Stay calm," Ladi shouted, her voice cutting through the panic. She reached for her sword and stepped to the front of her unit. The night was thick with shadows, and the only light came from the flickering flames of their campfire. Out of the darkness, the bandits appeared. They were swift and merciless, descending on Ladi's soldiers with vicious precision. The first few moments of the ambush were pure chaos. Steel clashed against steel, and the air filled with shouts and cries of pain. Ladi fought with everything she had, her sword moving like lightning as she cut down anyone who came too close. But the bandits were many, far more than Ladi had expected. They circled her and her soldiers, pushing them back toward the edge of the forest. Ladi's heart raced as she realized they were being overwhelmed. She had always been able to control every situation, every fight, but this time, things were spiraling out of her grasp. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her leg. She looked down to see an arrow embedded deep in her thigh. Blood gushed from the wound, and her leg buckled beneath her. Ladi fell to the ground with a thud, her sword slipping from her hand. "Ma'am?" One of her soldiers called out, rushing to her side. But before he could reach her, a bandit struck him down. Ladi's vision blurred as the pain intensified. She tried to push herself up, but her body refused to cooperate. For the first time in years, she felt truly vulnerable. As she lay on the ground, surrounded by the chaos of battle, a thought crept into her mind. Was this the end? Was this how the Iron Lady would fall, not in a blaze of glory, but in the dirt, defeated and alone? The battle raged on around Ladi, but her world had shrunk to the size of the wound in her leg. Each breath she took felt heavy, as if the weight of her choices, her life, was pressing down on her chest. She tried to pull herself toward her sword, but her strength was fading fast. Her soldiers continued to fight, but Ladi could see the fear in their eyes. Without her leading them, they faltered, unsure of what to do. The bandits sensed the shift in power and pressed their advantage, pushing Ladi's forces closer to defeat. The sounds of swords clashing and men shouting faded into the background as Ladi's vision blurred. The pain in her leg was unbearable, but worse than the physical pain was the realization that she had failed. For so long, she had built her life around being invincible, untouchable. But now, lying there in the dirt, she was just as fragile as anyone else. As the bandits closed in, Ladi's mind drifted back to her childhood. She remembered sitting alone on that hill, watching the other children play. She remembered the promise she had made to herself, that she would never be weak again. But here she was, weaker than ever, unable to protect herself or her soldiers. Just as the darkness began to close in around her, Ladi heard a voice, a calm, steady voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold on." She blinked, struggling to focus. Through the haze of pain, she saw a familiar face kneeling beside her. It was Danjuma. Ladi could hardly believe what she was seeing. Danjuma, the farmer she had humiliated in the market, was now kneeling at her side, his face full of concern. His hands were gentle as he examined her wound, but his eyes were focused and determined. "Stay still," he said softly, pulling a cloth from his bag to wrap around her injured leg. Ladi tried to speak, to tell him she didn't need help, that she could handle it on her own, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was too much, and her pride was too bruised. Danjuma worked quickly, tying the cloth tightly around her leg to stop the bleeding. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. Ladi was too weak to argue, so she let him lift her up, his strong arms carrying her away from the battle. Her soldiers, seeing her being carried to safety, fought harder, drawing the attention of the bandits so that Danjuma could make his escape with her. As they moved through the darkness, Ladi felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't in control, and though it was terrifying, it was also freeing. She didn't have to be strong right now. Someone else was strong for her. They reached the safety of a small hill, far enough from the battle that the noise of clashing swords and shouts of pain began to fade. Danjuma set her down gently on the ground, then knelt beside her, checking her wound again. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice full of quiet assurance. Ladi, her pride still wounded, managed to whisper, "Why are you helping me?" Danjuma looked at her for a long moment before answering, "Because you need it." Danjuma carried Ladi all the way back to Zaria, his pace steady and sure. By the time they arrived, her leg had stopped bleeding, but she was still too weak to walk. The townspeople gathered around them as Danjuma brought her to the healer's house, their eyes wide with surprise. The Iron Lady, the woman they feared and respected, was being carried like a helpless child. The healer, an elderly woman with kind eyes, immediately went to work, cleaning Ladi's wound and applying herbs to help with the pain. Ladi lay in bed, her mind racing. She had never felt so weak, so helpless, and it terrified her. But even more unsettling was the fact that it was Danjuma, the man she had treated so cruelly, who had saved her. For days, Ladi remained bedridden. The wound in her leg was deep, and the healer warned her that it would take time for her to recover. She hated being so dependent on others, but there was nothing she could do. Danjuma visited her every day, bringing food and checking on her progress. At first, Ladi refused to speak to him. Her pride wouldn't allow her to thank him, and she didn't know how to handle the kindness he was showing her. But Danjuma didn't seem to mind. He would sit by her bed, telling her stories about life on his farm, the crops he grew, and the challenges he faced. Slowly, Ladi began to listen. She found herself drawn to Danjuma's calm and gentle nature, so different from the harshness she was used to. He didn't try to impress her or make her feel small. He simply treated her with kindness, without expecting anything in return. As the days turned into weeks, Ladi's wound began to heal, but something else was happening too. The wall she had built around her heart, the wall that had kept her strong and distant for so long, was beginning to crumble. One afternoon, as Ladi sat in bed, staring out the window, Danjuma arrived with a basket of fresh fruit. He set it down on the table beside her, then sat in his usual chair by the window. "I've been thinking," Ladi said quietly, her voice softer than it had been in years, "about what happened at the market. I was wrong to treat you the way I did." Danjuma looked at her, surprised. "You don't need to apologize, Ladi. I know you've been through a lot." "No," Ladi said, shaking her head. "That's no excuse. I've spent my whole life trying to prove that I'm strong, that no one can hurt me, but I've hurt others in the process. I've used my power to push people down instead of lifting them up." Danjuma smiled gently. "You've always been strong, Ladi, but strength isn't about making people fear you. It's about knowing when to be kind." Ladi felt a lump form in her throat. She had always thought that power came from fear, from making sure no one could ever hurt her again. But now, sitting here with Danjuma, she realized that true strength came from something deeper, something she had never allowed herself to embrace. For the first time in years, Ladi allowed herself to feel vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, she found a new kind of strength. After weeks of recovery, Ladi's strength slowly returned. The wound on her leg healed, though the scar it left behind was a constant reminder of her vulnerability. But something far deeper than her injury had changed. Her heart had softened in ways she never thought possible. As Ladi regained her mobility, she knew it was time to return to the people of Zaria. She had spent years building a reputation as the Iron Lady, feared, powerful, untouchable. But now, with this new perspective, she felt uncertain about how the people would receive her. One morning, Danjuma found Ladi standing at the doorway, staring out into the bustling streets of Zaria. "Are you ready to face them?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ladi hesitated. Her hand rested on the doorframe, and her heart pounded with anxiety. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "They know me as someone who always uses power to get what I want. I don't know if they'll accept me." Danjuma smiled. "People can change, Ladi. They just need to see that change comes from the heart." With a deep breath, Ladi stepped out into the sunlight, walking with a slight limp toward the market. As she approached the crowded stalls, whispers spread like wildfire. People paused in their daily routines to watch her, some with fear in their eyes, others with curiosity. The Iron Lady had returned, but something was different. Ladi kept her head high, though her heart was heavy with guilt for the way she had treated the townspeople in the past. She made her way through the market until she spotted Danjuma's stall. It was as if time slowed as she walked up to him, her palms sweating with nervousness. The entire market fell silent. "I owe you all an apology," Ladi said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "For years, I've ruled with an iron fist. I believed that power meant making others fear me, but I was wrong. I see that now. I was blinded by my past, but that's no excuse for the way I treated all of you." Danjuma stood beside her, silently supporting her as the people listened. Ladi could see the surprise in their eyes, surprise that the woman they once feared was now admitting her mistakes. "I want to make things right," she continued. "I know it will take time, but I hope that one day you can forgive me." A hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, no one moved. Then, an elderly woman stepped forward, her wrinkled face softening into a smile. "We've all made mistakes, Ladi," she said. "What matters is that you've learned from them. We can see that." Slowly, others began to nod in agreement, murmuring their acceptance. Ladi's heart swelled with relief. She had feared that the people would reject her, but instead, they were offering her something she had never expected: understanding. Later that evening, after the market had cleared and the streets of Zaria were quiet once more, Ladi found herself back at Danjuma's farm. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the fields in golden light, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil. Danjuma was tending to his crops when Ladi approached him. He looked up from his work, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Ladi," he greeted her warmly, "you did well today. I think the people are starting to see the real you." Ladi smiled, though it was tinged with nervousness. "There's one more person I need to apologize to," she said quietly. Danjuma paused, then set down his tools. "You don't owe me an apology, Ladi." "Yes, I do," Ladi insisted. She stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her. "I treated you terribly at the market. I made you feel small in front of everyone, and you didn't deserve that. You've shown me nothing but kindness, and I repaid you with cruelty." Danjuma's eyes softened. "You were hurting, Ladi. I could see that. I didn't hold it against you then, and I don't hold it against you now." "But why?" Ladi asked, her voice barely a whisper. "After everything I did, why would you still help me? Why would you carry me out of that battle, tend to my wounds, and never ask for anything in return?" Danjuma smiled gently. "Because that's what we do for each other. We lift each other up, even when we've been knocked down. You're not the person you were that day in the market. I saw that even before you did." Ladi felt a lump form in her throat. For so long, she had believed that strength came from standing alone, from pushing others away. But now, she realized that true strength came from allowing others in, from letting yourself be vulnerable enough to accept help. "Thank you," Ladi said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing the good in me, even when I couldn't see it myself." From that day forward, Ladi began to live by a new code, one that was not built on fear or power, but on kindness and humility. She still carried the title of the Iron Lady, but now it meant something different. No longer was she the woman who used her strength to dominate others. Instead, she used her power to protect the weak, to lift up those who needed help. Word of Ladi's transformation spread throughout Zaria. The people no longer feared her. They respected her. She became a symbol of what it meant to be truly strong, not because of her physical prowess or her military rank, but because of her willingness to change, to learn, and to grow. Ladi began helping the townspeople with their daily struggles. She used her position in the army to ensure that the soldiers treated everyone with respect and fairness. She worked side by side with the farmers, learning from them and helping to plant crops during the harvest season. The once distant and feared Iron Lady had become a part of the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. But more than that, Ladi found peace within herself. For years, she had been at war with her past, trying to bury the pain of her childhood beneath layers of strength and pride. But now, she realized that true healing came not from hiding her pain, but from facing it head on and allowing herself to feel, really feel, what it meant to be human. Ladi's relationship with Danjuma also deepened during this time. They spent more and more time together, their conversations no longer filled with the awkwardness of the past. Ladi found comfort in Danjuma's quiet strength. One evening, as they walked through the fields together, Danjuma said something that stayed with Ladi. "The strongest people are the ones who've been through the hardest battles," he told her. "But the real strength comes from how they come out of those battles, whether they choose to let the pain make them bitter or make them better." Ladi smiled at him, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. She knew now that her journey had made her stronger in ways she could never have imagined, and for the first time in her life, she was truly at peace. The change in Ladi was undeniable. As the weeks went on, she became more involved in the daily life of Zaria, not as the feared soldier she once was, but as a woman who genuinely cared about the people around her. The children who had once run away from her now approached her eagerly, asking her to tell them stories about her time in the army. Ladi would sit with them under the shade of the great baobab tree, her once stern face softening into a smile as she recounted tales of her missions. But unlike the old Ladi, she no longer glorified the battles. Instead, she spoke of the importance of bravery, of standing up for what was right, and most importantly, of showing kindness, even in the face of conflict. One afternoon, as Ladi helped a group of women carry heavy sacks of grain from the market, she noticed something she hadn't before: the way people now smiled at her. It wasn't the forced, fearful smiles she had once been used to. These were genuine, warm smiles, full of gratitude and acceptance. It filled her heart in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you, Ladi," one of the women said as she wiped the sweat from her brow. "You've been such a blessing to this town." Ladi paused, taken aback by the woman's words. "I'm just doing my part," she replied humbly. The woman shook her head. "No, it's more than that. You've changed, and because of that, we've all changed too. You've shown us what real strength looks like." As Ladi walked home that evening, her mind was full of thoughts. She had spent so many years chasing power, believing that it was the only way to protect herself from the pain of her past. But now, she realized that power wasn't about control or fear. It was about using whatever strength you had to help others. For the first time in her life, Ladi didn't feel alone. She felt connected to the people of Zaria in a way she never had before. And though she had once thought that showing kindness made you weak, she now understood that it was the very thing that made her stronger. Ladi's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the men who had once been her peers in the army. At first, they were skeptical of her new approach. "The Iron Lady is going soft," some of them whispered among themselves. But as time passed, they saw that her new strength wasn't in her ability to command or intimidate. It was in the way she earned the respect and love of the people. One evening, during a town meeting, the village elders gathered to discuss the coming harvest and how to handle some issues with neighboring towns. Ladi was invited to sit among them, something that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. As the meeting progressed, a heated debate broke out about whether Zaria should impose stricter trade rules on a nearby town that had been acting unfairly in their dealings. Some of the elders, particularly the men, were in favor of cutting off all trade. Ladi listened quietly, her brow furrowed in thought. When the argument reached a peak, one of the elders turned to her. "What do you think, Ladi? Should we show them that we won't be taken advantage of? Should we use our strength to force them to respect us?" All eyes were on her, waiting for the fierce soldier to advocate for power and dominance as she once would have. But Ladi surprised them. "I understand the need for fairness," she began, her voice calm and measured. "But I've learned that true respect isn't earned through force. If we act out of anger or a need to prove our strength, we may win the battle, but we'll lose the trust of our neighbors. Instead, I think we should reach out to them with fairness and patience. If they refuse to meet us halfway, then we will reconsider. But let's give them the chance to do what's right." There was silence in the room. The men exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully. The elder who had asked the question seemed taken aback but impressed. "You've changed, Ladi," he said finally, "and it seems for the better." Ladi smiled. "We all have the capacity to change, and when we lead with our hearts, the path we take may be harder, but it's worth it." From that moment on, the people of Zaria looked to Ladi not just as a soldier, but as a leader, one who led with wisdom and kindness. As Ladi's relationship with the people of Zaria grew stronger, so too did her bond with Danjuma. They often spent their evenings together, walking through the fields or sitting by the riverbank as the sun set over the horizon. They talked about everything, about life, about the future, and about the changes Ladi had made within herself. One evening, as they sat together watching the stars appear in the sky, Danjuma turned to her, his expression serious yet kind. "Ladi," he began, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Lady looked at him, her heart beating a little faster. "What is it, Danjuma?" He paused for a moment, then smiled. "You've become someone I admire deeply, not because of your strength as a soldier, but because of your strength as a person. I see the way you care for the people, the way you've opened your heart, and I've fallen in love with you." Ladi blinked, completely caught off guard. She had never expected to hear those words from Danjuma. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of her emotions. For so long, she had believed that love was a weakness, something that made people vulnerable. But now, sitting beside Danjuma, she realized how wrong she had been. Before she could respond, Danjuma continued, his voice soft. "I know you may not feel the same way, and I don't want to pressure you, but I had to tell you how I feel." Ladi stared at him, her heart swelling with emotions she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. Danjuma had been there for her through everything, through her darkest moments and her journey of redemption. He had seen her at her worst and still believed in her, still cared for her. And now, looking at him, Ladi felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. "I don't know much about love," Ladi admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what I do know is that you've shown me a kindness I never thought I deserved, and that means more to me than you'll ever know." Danjuma smiled, his eyes twinkling in the fading light. "That's all I need to hear." A few days after Danjuma's confession, word spread throughout Zaria that the Iron Lady was to be married. The news caused a stir in the town. People whispered and gossiped, shocked by the surprising twist in Lady's story. The Iron Lady? Getting married? To Danjuma, the farmer? The townspeople exclaimed, laughing in disbelief. The very idea seemed absurd to those who had once feared Ladi, who remembered her as the fierce, unyielding soldier who had no time for love or tenderness. But the wedding preparations began in earnest, and soon the excitement spread through the town like wildfire. The people of Zaria, who had once avoided Ladi out of fear, now rallied together to help make the event a joyful one. They brought food, flowers, and gifts, eager to celebrate this new chapter in her life. On the day of the wedding, the entire town gathered at the village square. Ladi, dressed in a simple but beautiful gown, stood beside Danjuma, her heart full of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people she had once ruled with fear, and felt nothing but gratitude. As the ceremony began, a light breeze swept through the square, carrying with it the laughter of children and the chatter of the townspeople. It was a day of celebration, not just for Ladi and Danjuma, but for the entire community. And then, in a moment that was both unexpected and hilarious, one of the elders called out, "Danjuma, you've married the Iron Lady. What will you do if she orders you around?" The crowd erupted in laughter, and even Ladi couldn't help but join in. She looked at Danjuma, who was laughing heartily beside her, and shook her head with a smile. "I think I'll manage," Danjuma said, winking at Ladi. From that day forward, the people of Zaria often joked about how Danjuma had tamed the Iron Lady. But Ladi didn't mind. She knew that she hadn't been tamed. She had simply found something far more powerful than fear, love. The wedding was a day to remember. There was dancing, singing, and laughter that echoed through the streets of Zaria. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Lady let go of the walls she had built around herself. She laughed freely, danced with the children, and embraced the people who had once feared her. The townspeople couldn't stop marveling at the transformation. The Iron Lady, once feared for her coldness and harshness, was now someone they celebrated with. Ladi danced with the elders, laughed with the children, and held Danjuma's hand as they moved through the crowd together. It was a sight no one thought they'd ever see. When the sun finally set and the stars filled the sky, Ladi and Danjuma sat together under the same baobab tree where they had shared so many conversations. The night was peaceful, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves brought a sense of calm that Ladi had never felt before. As they sat in comfortable silence, Ladi realized something that had eluded her for years. True power wasn't about control or dominance. It wasn't about making others fear you. True power came from being able to love, to connect with others, and to find peace within yourself. And for the first time in her life, Ladi felt truly strong. After the wedding, Ladi's life transformed in ways she had never expected. Her days, once filled with military training and enforcing her authority, were now spent working on the farm with Danjuma. She learned to plant seeds, harvest crops, and care for animals. The work was hard, but it was peaceful, a stark contrast to the battlefield that had once defined her life. Danjuma had always worked the land with a quiet dignity, and Ladi quickly realized that there was something deeply fulfilling about the simplicity of farm life. The soil beneath her hands, the rhythm of planting and harvesting, it was a different kind of strength, one that came from nurturing rather than destroying. One day, as Ladi and Danjuma worked side by side in the fields, Danjuma paused and looked at her with a thoughtful smile. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd see you here, working on a farm." Ladi chuckled, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Neither did I. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be living this life, I would have laughed." Danjuma's smile widened. "And now?" "Now," Ladi said, her gaze sweeping over the green fields, "I wouldn't trade it for anything. I've spent so much of my life fighting, trying to prove I was strong. But here, with you, I've found something far better: peace." They continued working in silence, both content with the life they had built together. Ladi no longer felt the need to assert her strength at every turn. She had found her place, not through fear, but through love and community. As Ladi and Danjuma settled into their new life, Ladi began to notice how her transformation had affected the people around her. The once tense atmosphere in Zaria had softened. The soldiers who had once followed her harsh commands now approached her with respect, but not out of fear. They saw in her a leader who had learned to wield her power with kindness, and it inspired them to do the same. Ladi continued her work with the army, but her approach had completely changed. She no longer barked orders or demanded obedience through intimidation. Instead, she led by example, showing her soldiers that true strength came from protecting the weak and uplifting those in need. One morning, Ladi gathered her soldiers for a special meeting. They stood before her, curious about what she had to say. "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a soldier," Ladi began. "For years, I believed that being strong meant making others fear you, but I was wrong. Strength doesn't come from fear. It comes from kindness, from compassion, and I want us to be the kind of soldiers who protect, not oppress." The soldiers listened intently, many of them nodding in agreement. Ladi's transformation had not gone unnoticed, and many of the younger recruits admired her for the courage it took to admit her mistakes. "I know some of you may find this difficult," Ladi continued. "We've all been taught that power comes from control, but I'm asking you to try something different. The next time we're called to action, I want you to think about how we can help, not harm, how we can lift people up, not tear them down." The soldiers stood in silence for a moment before one of the younger recruits, a boy named Musa, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, "you've always been strong, but now you're showing us that strength isn't just about fighting. It's about doing what's right. I think we all want to be soldiers like that." Ladi smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Then let's do it together." Ladi's influence began to spread throughout Zaria. The town, once known for its strict soldiers and rigid leadership, became a place where people felt safe and supported. The change was palpable, and it was all thanks to Ladi's decision to lead with kindness. People from neighboring villages came to Zaria seeking advice and help. Ladi, along with Danjuma, welcomed them with open arms, offering guidance and support wherever they could. The reputation of Zaria grew, not because of its military strength, but because of the compassion and fairness its leaders showed. Ladi's legacy was not one of fear or domination, but of redemption. She had gone from being the Iron Lady, feared and respected for her ruthless power, to a beloved leader, admired for her courage to change. Her story became an inspiration to others, a reminder that no matter how far down the wrong path you go, there's always a way back to the right one. Word of Zaria's transformation reached the governor of Kaduna State. Curious about the stories he had heard, the governor decided to visit Zaria himself. When he arrived, he was greeted by Ladi and Danjuma, along with a group of soldiers and townspeople who had gathered to welcome him. The governor, a stern man with a reputation for being tough on law and order, had heard about Ladi's past. He had expected to meet a fierce and unyielding woman, but what he found surprised him. "I've heard much about you, Ladi," the governor said as they walked through the town. "They say you were once feared as the Iron Lady, but now the people speak of you with admiration." Ladi nodded. "I've made many mistakes, Governor, but I've learned that true strength comes from helping others, not making them fear you." The governor raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her words. And how did you come to this realization? Ladi glanced at Danjuma, who was walking beside her. With the help of those who showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it, I realized that fear only creates division, but kindness builds trust and unity. That's what I want for Zaria. The governor studied her for a moment before smiling. It seems Zaria is in good hands. You've set an example that many could learn from. As Ladi and Danjuma's life together flourished, they became role models not just for the people of Zaria, but for the next generation. The children who had once feared Ladi now looked up to her as a mentor, eager to learn from her wisdom. One day, Ladi gathered a group of children from the town and took them to the baobab tree, where she often told stories. The children sat eagerly at her feet, their eyes wide with anticipation. "Tell us another story, Auntie Ladi," one of the children exclaimed. Ladi smiled and sat down beside them. "All right, I'll tell you a story," she said. "But this one isn't about battles or soldiers. It's about a girl who thought she had to be strong by making people fear her. But she learned that real strength comes from the heart, from showing kindness and standing up for what's right." The children listened intently as Ladi told the story of her own transformation, though she framed it as a fable about a girl named Amira. They hung on to her every word, their young minds absorbing the lesson that kindness was a greater power than fear. When the story was over, one of the children, a bright-eyed boy named Sani, raised his hand. "Does that mean we should always be kind, even when someone is mean to us?" Ladi nodded. "Yes, Sani. It's not always easy, but kindness is the strongest weapon we have. It doesn't mean you let people hurt you, but it does mean you look for ways to make things better, not worse." The children left that day with more than just a story. They left with the knowledge that the world could be a better place if they chose to lead with kindness, just as Ladi had done. As the years passed, Ladi and Danjuma's love deepened, and their lives continued to blossom in Zaria. One day, Ladi received the news that would change her life once more. She was expecting a child. The months passed, and as Ladi's belly grew, so did her excitement. She had once been the Iron Lady, feared and distant, but now she was about to embark on a new journey, motherhood. When the day finally came, Ladi gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Fatima, after Ladi's mother, whose memory had stayed with her all these years. Holding her daughter in her arms for the first time, Ladi felt a profound sense of peace. The fierce warrior who had once been consumed by anger and fear was now a mother, filled with love and hope for the future. Fatima was a bright and curious child, and as she grew, she became the light of her parents' lives. Ladi and Danjuma raised her with the values they had learned together: kindness, humility, and strength through compassion. Ladi's journey from the Iron Lady to a beloved leader, wife, and mother was one of growth, redemption, and self-discovery. She had once believed that power came from fear, but through her experiences and the love of those around her, she learned that true strength comes from the heart. The story of Ladi's transformation spread far beyond the borders of Zaria, becoming a legend that was passed down through generations. It served as a reminder that no matter how lost we may feel, no matter how far we may stray, there is always a way back to kindness, compassion, and love. The moral of Ladi's story was simple. True strength is not found in fear, but in kindness. Power does not come from making others feel small. It comes from lifting them up. And in the end, Ladi's greatest legacy wasn't her time as a soldier or her reputation as the Iron Lady. It was the love she gave, the kindness she showed, and the lives she touched along the way. Thank you for watching.